two mics at the front of the... and if you can keep your questions short, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay. Is it turned on? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, just I guess taking into effect that we are actually in a time of slow suicide, when would you predict, in terms of actual objective time, then when, I guess, as you say, the last digital hand will be played?
Well, it's a great question. I think it's actually already happened. I think these are ineluctably irreversible tendencies. I don't mean that particularly pessimistically, but as an objective analysis of our situation. I mean, really, and you can pick up the Globe and Mail or the New York Times this week, and you can read a laconic news report that says the polar ice cap's melting is supposed to be 2050, but seems going to happen in 4 years. And it turned to the business pages, and you can see madcap oil companies feverishly plotting new oil routes, cheered on by all the business pages of the world through the Arctic. You know, in fact, that at a deep ethical level, we've entered into an age of like just profound cynical indifference, of an attempt to, it's what the American sociologist, social theorist, Mark Talcott Parsons, out of Harvard once said what really sets us apart is our enhancement of adaptive capacity. And enhancement of adaptive capacity, it's a digital hand. Yeah. Well, it just turns out that those, predictions by like someone like Parsons, a bourgeois theorist, but a person I read always with acute interest, because I always viewed him as a Virgil of American imperial power, telling me how the cybernetic world was going to unfold. We're just sort of prophecies of a kind of cybernetic reason that was ready to enter the human skin, and it now has entered the human skin at some deep ineluctable level. And the talk tonight I gave is really tried to just draw into visibility the moral and ethical consequence of this. Consequence of moving from an age which Heidegger could predict it was that beings begin with coming into subjectivity to what I now would say is coming into transsubjectivity. That's the notion of the digital.
It's great to hear you talk again. I just wanted to ask a question. Stellar says that the body is obsolete, and hence would probably say that human bodies don't matter because they're too slow to keep up with, the crash technologies of acceleration that you described. Virilio says that it's precisely in virtue of our being kind of obsolete, operating on a different register, that keeps us inoculated from the vampire metaphysics that you described in Go to Technology. So I just wanted to kind of ask the question of, does crafting or constructing an alternate mythos of the perverted drone presume that we have to dive into drone flesh or kind of engage in biohacking and those kinds of things?
Yeah, well, I like perversity a lot. I like vampire novels and all things liminal. I have a continuing love story with this. I would disagree. Stellar's a very good buddy of mine. We always have this argument. We just separate. Stellar never says my body, always says the body, because he treats his body as the experimental staging set for sometimes cruel and capricious, but always endlessly interesting experiments and so on. But he has a positivistic notion of the body itself. He's a roboticist. And Virilio, from my account, goes off track because of his Catholic humanism, basically. And he waxes into nostalgia for the body. And sort of stand, I don't know, it's terrible to say it. It's so liberal. Sort of somewhere between these two. I just think that if you're living in times of transsubjectivity, follow someone like Baudrillard's advice. If you're living in delirious times, think deliriously. If you're living in times of transsubjectivity, try to think in terms of ontologies and transsubjectivities and what it really means to think algorithmically. Like take your texts and try to see if you can spin them out as vertiginous videos that have very different effective forms itself.
Cool. Thanks very much.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for your lecture.
Can you speak up? Because we just can't hear.
Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Okay. When I was listening to your talk, I couldn't help but thinking about aesthetics. And I'm really interested in the aesthetic, I guess, aesthetic element, not in terms of creativity or art, but aesthetic in terms of political. And what is the aesthetic of the drone? And how does that play into the political and the transcendent, or whatever you want to call it, and perverse?
Yeah. Well, the aesthetic of the drone is purely kinetic. And it's purely kinetic because it operates as an energy space, hovers in a kind of liminal space now and in the future between two different things. On the one hand, it's like a slaved function. It's cybernetic intelligence at the behest of absolutely murderous instincts by imperial power. Obama leading the way, right? Technological liberalism to the hyper. When I said, these notions of you can catch it on the face, I was thinking in a famous scene of Obama and Hillary Clinton gasps of astonishment, but I look in Obama's eyes. He doesn't have gasped astonishment. He has just the cold, kind of calculating gaze of this ability to really project power globally through Zeus-like fingertips around the world itself. I mean, he's coming into the trans-subjectivity of hegemonic, murderous power that can be localized anywhere around the world. At the same time, drones really have, like any technologies, have, I believe, effective qualities. They have possibilities of perversion. We're working with a group at the SME Media Lab at the University of California, San Diego, Ricardo Dominguez, and Jordan Crandall. Jordan Crandall is such an interesting artist. He's an artist of unmanned perception. Ricardo Dominguez and does, recently did the trans-border immigrant tool to help immigrants get across the border in sort of safe ways itself. But all of us are interested in the notion of how do you, in fact, begin to pervert drones itself? How do you make drones into, like, local forms of counter-surveillance, for example, that has a distinctly public dimension itself? And the importance of which is amplified by the fact by a video that Ricardo did recently in New York City during Occupy when they tried to put a little drone up so they could see what the police forces were doing, massing down the streets and stuff. They were immediately violently taken down. Surveillance doesn't like counter-surveillance, and drone logic doesn't like a sort of counter-drone logic itself. So I would say the political dimension lies in liminality, kinetics, and the element of perversity that's introduced into this.
Maybe one more quick question.
I just have one question, two really. So the promise of an affective drone, you've seen the film Terminator 4, where there's this human Terminator, right? And he has a kind of morality. So is the affective drone, does it give us a kind of sense of security? In the sense that if I have a gun pointed to my head, I'm going to want that thing to assume that I'm human, and then to take maybe some circumstances, into account. And the same thing, but maybe we could also say that the drones aren't any different from the protocols of pushing the big red button, right? And there's a list of protocols we can think of the film, the critique of it, Dr. Strangelove, it's all about protocol. It's a critique of protocol, of having all these things. If, scenario A happens, then do B, push red button. And then we have movies like The Hunt for Red October, where the first officer, takes the captain over and says, no, you're not thinking with the millions of people you're going to kill by pushing the red button. So how do affective drones actually give us security, in the sense?
Well, I saw a film recently. Do you remember the name of the film? Yeah. The one about the drones on the border, where you're plugged in the borders. It's called Sleepers. Maybe this will provide the Alex Rivera. Yeah. It's one of the most chilling films I've ever seen in my life. And it is called something like Sleepers. Sleepwalkers. And so it's a Mexican filmmaker making a film about drones. And he connects drones to migrant labor and to the border, which when you're in San Diego is like so risible and so visible. Sleep dealers. So in this you struggle up to the border, but you don't cross over the border. You're out of money. And so you sort of sell your body and your mind to drone machines. What happens is you sort of go into these kind of steel vaults algorithmically centralized places. You plug in your mind, and you start seeing it just purely ontological. All you see is dangling bodies. There's kind of still are dangling bodies, actually. Moving episodically, they're controlled by the artificial intelligence. And what's happening through the artificial intelligence is that you colonize your mind, you allow your mind to be purely distributed forms of consciousness, and then your body is labored. You're suddenly on a skyscraper in New York City. You're walking out on a beam over immense chasms of distance itself. And it's a perfect form of like combination of dronal consciousness and an absolute intensification of all forms of hyper-colonialism itself. It's really the notion of colonized bodies. So the way that drones operate at the effective level is not particularly a happy story. At the effective level, that what they want to do to control most of all is in fact to parasite the affect of human beings itself. And in the future, I believe they'll play out every scenario of human emotion and probably do it more viscerally. And the normal mechanics of power and unequal distributions of wealth in the world, of predatory violence, will be intensified, not lessened, if my reading has any purchase to it.
Okay, we're going to take one very short, final question.
Short question. Fantastic film, Mary Louise and Arthur. That was amazing. Transsubjectivity as resistance. I came in about half the way through, so I don't know if you talked about that, but the various forms of resistance that are occurring, how do they fit in with the overall conception of transsubjectivity?
Well, the times that we're in are times of, these three types. The argument I was making is that we're actually in the beginnings of a new age of mythos, of technological mythos. As drift, as acceleration, and I think we're well beyond the technologies of acceleration. We've already been lifted off, in every domain of human existence. And the present age is this age of weightlessness, of vertiginous media spin, of drift sex and drift consciousness, and drift bodies and drift attention, and all sort of imbued with an effective sense and real sense of crash. When the will of technology crashes, liberty crashes into the human condition, and the implosions happen as a result of that. The politics of our time, particularly the street politics of Occupy, are an absolutely perfect form of politics for a drift culture, because they take the qualities of drift. They're liminal, they fluidly move to sites of power, they're not destroyed when they're reoccupied by imperial violence, they reinvent themselves in new form. They're students in the streets of Montreal, whose only common denominator is purely visual, it's chromatic. It's the red badge which is put on. They adopt strategies that Artaud would be proud of. They adopt strategies of counter-resistance based on, détournement of impossible exchanges of communication with police forces. And I sort of know those students because I taught for 20 years in Montreal and had many students, the best student activists in Montreal were themselves always reading theater closely and trying to think of Montreal as like a theater of the streets itself. So for myself, I just watch what students, particularly and activists, are doing as they invent forms of politics that are equal to the drift of our times itself. It's drift politics. That's not to say that imperial violence has gone away, because imperial violence is first to the scene. It really understands acceleration. It absolutely takes advantage of drift. That's the political economy of globalization. And it seems to make a lot of money in crash. I mean, that's what the tanker is about to go through, the article is all about. Thanks.
Okay, I think we should